Chapter 1. The Price of Victory. The war had been long, brutal, and merciless. Two empires, once distant enough to ignore each other's existence, had been drawn into conflict over the thin, volatile strip of space that lay between their territories. The HFY Dominion, proud and ancient, had ruled the outer systems for millennia, their strength unmatched, their warriors feared across the stars. And then there were the humans, newcomers to galactic power, ambitious, reckless, unyielding. At first, the HFY had dismissed them as insignificant, a species too young to be a real threat. That mistake had cost them dearly. The war had lasted 6 years. 6 years of battles in space and on the ground, of ships torn apart in the vacuum, of cities turned to ash, of soldiers fighting and dying on planets whose names meant nothing to them. The HFY were stronger, their technology more advanced, their tactics honed over centuries of conquest. But the humans had something else: persistence, adaptability, an unwillingness to break even when the odds were against them. They learned from every defeat, adjusted, evolved, grew sharper, more efficient, more ruthless. And in the end, it was not brute force that decided the war. It was attrition. The Dominion had grown too large, stretched too thin, its fleets divided across too many battlefronts, its supply lines fraying under the weight of endless war. The humans, though smaller in number, were relentless. They struck where the HFY were weak, cut off their reinforcements, bled them out over time. Until one day, the proud Dominion, which had once stood unchallenged among the stars, fell. The surrender had been humiliating. The great war fleets of the HFY were dismantled, their worlds occupied, their ruling caste forced to kneel before human leaders who had once been nothing more than nameless threats in the void. It was the kind of loss that a species never truly recovers from. And for those who had once been nobility, commanders, warriors, there was no mercy. Among them was Caliph. She had been a general, once a leader of the HFY war machine, a strategist whose mind had turned the tides of countless battles, a warrior whose name had been spoken with reverence. Now, she was nothing. Stripped of her rank, her armor, her honor, she had been paraded before the victors, displayed like a trophy of war, a reminder to all of what had been taken from the Dominion. But even humiliation had not been enough for the humans. The Dominion had been defeated. Its leaders had been taken as spoils. She was one of them, taken from her people, bound, unarmed, given to a human as a prize, a thing to be owned, a living relic of a war that had shattered her world. She had sworn, in that moment, that she would never yield. Not to them. Not to him. Never. A new master. The ship that carried her away from HFY Prime was small, human-built, a vessel designed for long-distance travel rather than war. She had never set foot on one before, had never even thought she would need to. But now, this ship was her prison, carrying her away from the last remnants of her people, from everything she had known, from everything she had fought for. She sat in the corner of the cargo bay, her wrists bound in metal cuffs, the collar around her throat a humiliating reminder of what she had become. She was no longer a general, no longer a warrior. She was property. Her captor, her new master, had yet to speak to her. She had seen him only briefly when they had boarded the ship together. A human male, tall, broad-shouldered, his movements controlled, precise, as if he were used to handling dangerous things. He had not looked at her with cruelty, but neither had he looked at her with kindness. He had simply looked at her, as if trying to decide what to do with her. Now, as the engines hummed beneath her, as the walls of this foreign ship closed in around her, she hated him. She hated all of them. She had spent her life fighting, had dedicated herself to the Dominion, had spilled blood and sacrificed everything for victory. And now, she was here, bound like an animal, given away as a prize. The door to the cargo bay hissed open. She did not look up. She would not give him the satisfaction. But she could hear his footsteps, steady, deliberate, moving closer. And then, his voice. "You haven't spoken since we left the planet." She did not answer. "I assume you understand my language. Your people were fluent enough when they were giving orders to kill mine." Still, she remained silent. A sigh, a shift of movement. And then, he crouched down in front of her. Her body tensed not in fear, but in fury, in defiance. She hated him for being close, for looking at her as if she was something he could study, something he could understand. "You have a name?" he asked. She did not answer. She would not let him take that from her, too. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in frustration, not in anger, in calculation. "Your people fought well," he said, as if testing her. "But they lost. And now here we are." Her hands clenched into fists, the metal cuffs digging into her wrists. She wanted to tear his throat out. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Do you even know why you were given to me?" Finally, she spoke, her voice low, sharp, filled with all the hatred she felt burning inside her. "Because your kind has no honor." There was no reaction, no anger, no amusement, just a quiet, unshaken certainty in his voice as he answered. "Because they didn't know what else to do with you." She frowned, her breath catching slightly. That was not the answer she had expected. He was not treating her like a trophy, not like a slave, not like something to be used and discarded. And that realization unnerved her more than anything else, because it meant she did not understand him, and that made him dangerous. The beginning of something else. She had expected cruelty, expected violence, expected to be treated as nothing more than the spoils of war, like every other Vicar prisoner who had fallen into human hands. But days passed, then weeks, and he never touched her, never raised a hand to her, never looked at her like she was less than him. And it was infuriating, because it meant she could not hate him the way she wanted to. He was not weak. That much she knew. She had seen the strength in his stance, the precision in his movements, the scars on his hands. He had fought in the war. He had killed her kind. And yet he did not treat her as an enemy. Not anymore. And for the first time in her life, Caliph did not know what to do. Chapter 2. The chains begin to break. Time had become a slow, unyielding thing aboard the human ship. Each day bled into the next, the hum of the engines a constant presence beneath Caliph's feet, a reminder that she was nowhere near home. Not that she had a home anymore. The war had seen to that. The Dominion had fallen, its rulers scattered, its warriors either dead or in chains. And she, once a general, once a force to be reckoned with, was now just another relic of a defeated empire, given away like a piece of war plunder. But she would not break. Even if she had been stripped of her rank, even if her armor had been taken from her, she would not let them take her spirit. She had expected her captivity to be filled with suffering, with cruelty. She had braced herself for torment, for degradation, for the kind of treatment she had seen humans endure when they had fallen into Vicar hands. She had been prepared to hate, to resist, to endure. But it had not been like that. The human, her captor, her so-called master, had done none of the things she had steeled herself against. He had not beaten her. He had not humiliated her. He had not tried to break her in the way she expected. Instead, he had been patient, calculated, always watching her, but never in the way the others had during her capture. Not like a man looking at something he owned. And that unsettled her more than anything. She had refused to speak to him in the beginning, answering his questions with silence, her stare cold, her body rigid with defiance. He would get nothing from her. But he had been patient, too patient. He did not force words from her. He did not demand submission. He simply let time pass, letting the weight of her own silence press down on her instead. And when he did speak to her, his words were never cruel, never filled with the arrogance of a conqueror. They were questions, observations, statements that she could not ignore. "You don't see yourself as a prisoner, do you?" he had asked one evening, leaning against the bulkhead, his arms crossed, watching her from across the room where she sat, bound but unbroken. She had not answered. "You still think of yourself as a soldier." Again, silence. But his gaze had been knowing. "The war is over, Caliph, but you're still fighting." Her name on his lips had made her tense, a reminder that he knew who she was, knew what she had been, what she had lost. "What else am I supposed to be?" she had snapped, before she could stop herself. He had tilted his head, considering her. "That's for you to decide." She had hated that answer, hated that it sounded so simple. Because it wasn't. She had spent her entire life knowing exactly what she was: a warrior, a leader, a force of the Dominion. Now, she was none of those things. Now, she was nothing. And that was a truth she did not want to face. The first fractures. It had been 2 weeks since they left VA space. Kalith had begun to notice small things, details that she had ignored at first but could no longer dismiss. Her captor, the human, was not like the others she had encountered during the war. He was not drunk with victory, not filled with the arrogance of the conquerors who had brought her people to their knees. He did not speak to her as if she were lesser. He did not flaunt his dominance over her. In fact, he barely treated her like a captive at all. He brought her food without cruelty, setting it down near her without forcing her to acknowledge him. He allowed her to move around the ship, cautiously at first, testing her boundaries, seeing if she would try to escape. She had, in the beginning, testing the doors, memorizing the ship's layout. But it had been pointless. There was nowhere to run. And still, he did not punish her. He merely observed. It was maddening, because if he was not going to treat her like a prisoner, then what was she? She was supposed to hate him, hate all of them. But the hatred was beginning to feel hollow, because he did not fit the image of the enemy she had built in her mind. He did not sneer at her, did not mock her, did not treat her as something to be broken. He simply existed beside her, waiting for her to decide what she would do with her own survival. And that terrified her more than anything. A change she did not want. One night, as the ship drifted through the void, she found herself watching him instead. He was at the controls, adjusting course, his brow furrowed in thought. He was focused, controlled, but there was something else beneath that exterior. A quiet, steady weight that she recognized all too well. He was alone, just as she was. The realization unnerved her. She had always thought of humans as creatures of pack mentality, always relying on their numbers, their bonds, their need for connection. But he was alone. There was no crew, no allies waiting to receive him at their destination. She should have seen him as weak for it. But she didn't. She saw a warrior who had fought just as hard as she had, lost just as much as she had, and yet had not allowed himself to be consumed by it. And that made her hate him just a little less. She did not speak to him that night. But when he passed her a meal, she did not refuse it. And that, she realized, was the first crack in the wall she had built. A new battle. Another week passed. She had begun to speak to him, though only in short, guarded words. A question here, an observation there. He never pushed her, never forced her to say more than she was willing. One evening, as they sat across from each other, the hum of the ship the only sound between them, he finally asked the question she had been dreading. If you had won the war, what would you have done to me? She stilled. She had not expected him to ask that, because she knew the answer. And he knew it too. The VA did not take human prisoners. And yet, here he was, treating her with more mercy than she would have given him. She hated that realization. She hated that it made her respect him. And she hated that she did not know who she was supposed to be anymore. The war had ended. But a different battle had begun, a battle within herself. And this time, she did not know if she wanted to win. Chapter 3. The Heart of the Enemy. The days blurred into weeks aboard the ship, an endless stretch of silence punctuated only by the steady hum of the engines and the occasional exchange of words between Kalith and the human. The hatred she had clung to so fiercely, the resentment that had been her only anchor in the aftermath of the war, was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of his patience, his quiet, his refusal to be the monster she needed him to be. She had spent so much of her life defining herself by war. It had shaped her, forged her, made her into a creature of strategy, of dominance, of absolute certainty in her purpose. The Dominion had been her home, her identity, and when it had been torn apart, she had clung to what little remained: her rage, her defiance, the unshakable belief that her people had been the stronger force, even in defeat. But now, here, in the vast emptiness of space, away from the war, away from the echoes of battle, she was beginning to see the truth. The war had already been lost long before the final surrender. The humans had not won because they were stronger. They had won because they refused to lose. She had underestimated them, all of them, and now, she found herself trapped in the quiet aftermath of it all, forced to reckon with what that meant. Her captor her keeper was no longer the faceless enemy she had once believed all humans to be. He had fought, he had suffered, and yet, he had never once treated her with cruelty, never once reminded her of the power he had over her. It was infuriating. It was unsettling. And worst of all, it was working. Because the more time she spent aboard his ship, the more she realized that she was not his prisoner. She was something else entirely. Something he was waiting for her to understand on her own. Breaking the silence. The moment she spoke to him without resentment, she felt it shift between them. It had been a simple thing. A question. Nothing important. Nothing that should have mattered. And yet it did. What is your name? She had never asked before. Not because she didn't know it, she had heard others speak it when she had been handed over to him, when she had been branded as his prize. But she had refused to say it. Because saying it would have meant acknowledging something deeper. That he was not just the enemy. That he was not just her captor. That he was, in the simplest, most infuriating way, a person. And now, as she sat across from him in the dimly lit cockpit, the vast expanse of space stretching endlessly before them, she had asked. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a long moment, he did not answer. Not because he did not want to, but because he knew, as well as she did, what it meant. Finally, he spoke. Reed. The name sat between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the thing neither of them wanted to say. The war was over, and neither of them knew what came next. Lessons in humanity. Kalith was a warrior. She had been raised in war, trained in war, had known nothing else. The VA car did not waste time on sentiment, did not believe in weakness, did not value anything beyond strength and efficiency. And yet, here, in the quiet corridors of this ship, she was learning something she had never been taught before. She was learning what it meant to simply exist. She found herself watching him more often now, not with suspicion, not with resentment, but with something else, something she could not name. She watched the way he repaired the ship with methodical precision, the way he spoke aloud to himself when working through a problem, the way he sighed when exhausted but never complained. She watched the way his hands moved, calloused but careful, the way he carried himself with a confidence that was not arrogance, the way he seemed, in some strange, unspoken way, to trust her. She did not understand it. Why was he like this? Why did he not treat her as his enemy, his prize, his captive? Why did he insist on acting as though she were simply a person? She did not know what to do with that, and that terrified her more than anything. Something unspoken. One night, as she stood by the viewport, staring out at the endless stars, she felt his presence before he spoke. You're not going to kill me in my sleep, are you? She turned to him, raising an eyebrow. If I were, would you stop me? He considered that for a moment, then shrugged. Probably not. She frowned. That's stupid. He smirked. Maybe. She studied him then, her gaze sharp, searching. You don't see me as your prisoner, do you? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what you are, Kalith, but I know what you're not. She tilted her head. And what am I not? His gaze met hers, steady, unflinching. You're not broken. Her breath caught, because for the first time since the war ended, she wasn't sure if that was true. But the way he said it like it was a fact, like it was something he believed in even when she couldn't believe it herself, made her want to believe it, even just for a moment. The shift. There was a moment. A single moment when everything changed. It was nothing grand, nothing dramatic. It was the way he reached for her without hesitation when the ship jolted from an unexpected gravitational anomaly, his hand gripping her wrist, steadying her before she could fall. It was the way she didn't pull away, the way her fingers curled around his just slightly, a reaction she did not fully control, did not fully understand. The way he looked at her then, not as an enemy, not as something conquered, but as something else. And the way she realized she wanted him to look at her like that. She did not know how long she stood there, gripping his hand, her heartbeat loud in her ears. But she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that this was the moment she would remember, because this was the moment the war between them ended. A decision made. When he next spoke, his voice was softer, but no less certain. You don't have to stay with me. She swallowed hard. And if I left? A slow exhale. Then I'd let you go. The words settled deep in her chest, because they both knew the truth. She was not his captive. She never had been. She had been given to him as a prize, as a spoil of war. But she had not stayed because of chains. She had stayed because, somehow, she no longer wanted to leave. And so, for the first time, she chose. She chose to stay. She chose him. She chose to find out what came next. And for the first time in her life, she was free. Chapter 4. Love in the Ruins. The decision to stay should have felt heavier, but it did not. Instead, it settled over Caliph like the whisper of a long-forgotten truth, like the first breath of air after drowning. She had spent so much time fighting against everything, against him, against herself, against the reality of what had been done to her. She had been raised in war, forged in the fire of battle, told that there was only victory or death. But now, here she was, standing at the threshold of something else entirely. She had spent weeks convincing herself that she was a captive, that she had no choice, that the human Reed was merely another link in the chain that bound her. But the truth had been staring her in the face all along. And now that she had finally allowed herself to see it, there was no turning back. She was not his prisoner. She had never been. He had given her space, time, the ability to decide. She had spent her entire life being commanded, being told what to do, who to be, how to fight, how to serve. And now, for the first time, no one was commanding her at all. Reed had told her she could leave, but she did not want to. The war was over, and maybe it was time to stop fighting. A new kind of battle. The first few days after she had chosen to stay were different, not because anything outwardly changed, but because everything had changed. The silence between them was no longer tense, no longer filled with unspoken threats and simmering resentment. Now, it was something else entirely. She could feel it in the way Reed moved around her now, more relaxed, more open, as if he, too, had been waiting for this shift. She could hear it in the way their conversations stretched longer, no longer just sharp exchanges of necessity, but something deeper, something neither of them dared put a name to yet. And she could feel it in herself, in the way her gaze lingered on him longer than it should, in the way she found herself listening to the sound of his voice even when he wasn't speaking to her, in the way his presence no longer felt like a cage, but like something else entirely. She hated it, and she needed it, and she did not know what to do with that. An unexpected gesture. One evening, as she stood near the viewport, staring out at the endless stretch of space, he did something that caught her completely off guard. He handed her a weapon. A small one, just a simple plasma blade, the kind used more for utility than for combat. But it was still a weapon, and it was still freedom. She stared at it for a long moment, then up at him, searching his face for a trick, a trap, some hidden meaning she could not yet understand. "You trust me with this?" she asked slowly. Reed shrugged. "You're not a prisoner." Her fingers curled around the hilt of the blade, testing its weight. "I could kill you with this." His lips twitched slightly, a shadow of a smirk. "You could have killed me in my sleep weeks ago if you really wanted to." Her grip tightened, not in anger, but in something else, something dangerous, something familiar. It was the same feeling she had when she stood before an opponent on the battlefield, when the tension in the air was razor-sharp, when the moment before the first strike held more weight than the strike itself. But this was not a battlefield, and Reed was not her enemy. Her gaze locked onto his, and in that moment, she realized what he was truly doing. He was giving her power, a choice, again, always, and she did not know what was more terrifying, the fact that he trusted her, or the fact that she wanted to prove that trust right. She flicked the blade on, the soft hum of its energy filling the space between them. Then she turned it off, sliding it into the sheath on her belt, where it rested not as a threat, but as a promise. She met his eyes. "I won't use it on you." A slow nod. "I know." And that was the end of it. For now. Crossing a line that was never there. The shift between them was subtle, but it was there. She could feel it in the way they moved around each other, now closer, unafraid, no longer circling one another like two predators waiting for the other to strike. She noticed how he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, how he hesitated just slightly before speaking sometimes, as if weighing his words more carefully than before. And she noticed how she did the same. One night, she found herself in the cockpit with him again, sitting across from him as he worked on a maintenance report. She wasn't sure how she had ended up there. She had chosen to sit there, had chosen not to be alone, and that realization unsettled her. She glanced at him, watching as he leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face, his exhaustion evident. Humans tired easily. You should rest, she said before she could stop herself. He looked at her, surprised, then smirked. Didn't know you cared. She scowled. I don't. But if you fall asleep at the controls, we'll both die. And that would be inconvenient. He chuckled, but he stood anyway, stretching. Noted. Then, before he left the room, he hesitated. And then, he did something that made the entire universe tilt. He reached out, not to restrain her, not to test her, not to challenge her. Just a simple, fleeting touch, a brush of his fingers against her arm as he passed. It was barely there. And yet, it was everything. Because he had never touched her before. Not once. Not until now. Not until she was ready for it. She did not move, did not flinch, did not react. She only stared at the place where his fingers had been. And for the first time since the war ended, she felt something she could not fight. Something she did not want to fight. A confession in the dark. It happened on a quiet night, when the weight of everything could no longer be ignored. She was standing near the viewport again, lost in thought, when he joined her. He always seemed to know when she needed company, even if she never asked for it. For a long time, neither of them spoke. And then, finally, he broke the silence. I never wanted this. She turned to him, frowning. What? His jaw tightened slightly, his gaze fixed on the stars. The war. The way it ended. The things they did to your people after. Her throat tightened. It wasn't your choice. He exhaled, his hands curling into fists. No, but I didn't stop it either. She studied him for a long time. And you regret that? A slow nod. Silence stretched between them again. But this time, it was different. Because now, she understood. She reached out, hesitated, then placed her hand over his. He looked down, startled, but did not pull away. She swallowed hard. I never wanted this either. The war, the loss, the hatred. But maybe, just maybe, this whatever this was something she could want. Something she could choose. And for the first time, she did. She leaned in, and he did not stop her.